Alright, gang, this is the second video for the third week of class in our first unit, the last week of our first unit, on basic theories, basic concepts, basic dynamics of persuasion, and we're dealing a lot with, as I think you probably gathered at this point, we're dealing with a lot of like psychological stuff here, and I think that's the hallmark of modern contemporary theories of persuasion. As we saw in the very first week of this unit, persuasion goes back to Aristotle in terms of robust theories of what it is and how it works. But things become pretty specific in the 20th century with our kind of new ways of sort of testing, experimenting on what's going on in the brain. And we're learning a lot more about psychological proclivities and tendencies, vulnerabilities, and so on. So today we're going to be looking at the last of our four basic models. There's other stuff that we could be looking at. I was trying to, kind of cover the range as best as possible and get at some pretty interesting stuff. And inoculation theory is, I feel, especially relevant to kind of where we're at right now in terms of messaging, social influence, this question of threats and vulnerabilities, and how we can ready ourselves. So let's just go ahead and dive in with this reading by Josh Compton. So this comes from a different book than the Perloff book, a similar type book. All the information's at the bottom there. And I guess Compton and Fau have written a fair bit on inoculation theory, so he's kind of doing like a overview of the theory and the history of the theory and major issues. It's got a bit of an encyclopedia kind of vibe going on here. So it's really useful and helpful in a kind of total sense, but it also goes deeper than we need to go, and so I'll let you know, basically this is good enough, right? And so in the notes, again, I let you know basically at this point we're pretty good. We don't need to kind of keep going deeper and deeper because he's covering, the basic model and then kind of how it evolved and how theories evolved and the things that they started to take into consideration. And by the end of it, we're getting pretty nitty-gritty, and we don't need to get that nitty-gritty. Just want to kind of get at some of the basic dynamics, basic elements, important issues, and so on. First of all, when we're talking about, and I should sort of start off where he starts off, which is inoculation. That's like a medical thing. That's a biological thing, right? When we talk about inoculation, we're usually talking about getting flu shots or COVID vaccines. And the whole point is to give yourself a dosage of the thing, the very threat that you are trying to protect against, right? And so, for a long time, we have been getting flu shots. Not everyone, not all the time, but it's like, I hear that the flu is really bad this season. I better go get my flu shot. You go down, they give you a shot, and then for the next couple of days you feel kind of lousy because they've given you they've introduced into your system some of the dose, a little bit of the actual bug itself, so that your body can develop the antibodies and build up the resistance against it out in the wild kind of idea. And so it's a very powerful concept, right, which is, in order to guard against potential threats, we give ourselves a little experience of the threat in order to build up our resistance, in order to develop our antibodies, so to speak, right? So on the kind of medical biological level, it makes perfect sense because it actually works, right? We take this thing, our body kind of convulses and develops these new response mechanisms, and now we are stronger. We are better able to deal with the threat, right? Well, now what about when we're thinking about social communication, social influence, persuasion, messaging that's coming at us all the time? We know that language, communication, mediation are powerful things that can do powerful things, can lead people in this direction, can lead people in that direction. Maybe these are directions we don't want to go. Maybe we don't want to be influenced in a certain way. And so we can inoculate, and now I'm using scare quotes because now we're dealing with the analogy, right? It's not a direct one-to-one kind of back and forth. And the chapter is really makes an explicit kind of effort to kind of think about where the analogy is tight and where it's less tight. But basically, if you've ever had a debate with someone about choose your topic, choose your issue, and if it's one of these kind of good faith back and forths where you're giving them your best arguments for why you believe something and they're giving you their best arguments for why they believe like the opposite, that's called deliberation. That's this kind of sharing of views. Here's my kind of list of reasons why I hold this belief and they do the opposite. That whole process should either help you strengthen your own position because now you're more aware of the opposite position, or maybe it actually invites you to kind of rethink your position and, what's wrong with that? In some instances, maybe your position needs to be revised, right? That gets more back to the cognitive dissonance stuff and this, like, how do you cope with a threat, essentially, or how do you cope with this uncomfortable position of being confronted by difference and opposition? The point of the inoculation theory stuff is, in terms of communication and language and media and persuasion, is that, there's all this messaging that's coming at us, and a lot of it is potentially harmful in that it can, send us in a weird direction, or it can influence us to give over our life savings and join a movement, or, develop some weird lifestyle change that's actually really bad for us, but we've been convinced, right? So inoculation is meant to ward off those potential outcomes. So the example I begin the notes with here is this idea of going camping. I don't know if anyone's gone camping recently. I actually spent 2 months of this last summer in Vietnam doing some travel, doing a bit of research, bit of self-care, bit of like exploring. It's also part of a kind of larger personal project that I'm working on. And I just kind of wanted to do it because I had the ability. So I was in Vietnam for 2 months, and I remember for the 4 or so months leading up to my departure, I spent so much time doing research on gear, right? Like, what is the best bag to have? What's the best backpack to have? What are the best shoes, hiking shoes to have? The best thermos? What do I need in terms of medicine, first aid kind of stuff? What do I need in terms of technology and charging and a backup battery? And just thinking through all of these different scenarios where I might need this or I might need that, I was essentially inoculating myself against the kinds of threats that you encounter when you're traveling or if you're going camping. A threat, as I note here on, what number is it? Yeah, number 7. A threat is anything that you are vulnerable to, right? And so there's a direct relationship between a threat and a vulnerability, and you become vulnerable when you do not prepare properly, when you're not ready, right? Think about a big storm's coming through, a big hurricane or a tornado or whatever. Everyone knows it's coming. What do? Well, you need to get your water. You need to get your candles, your batteries, your backup food, you make sure that you have, blankets, make sure that you have some ability to try to communicate with people. Maybe you need a 4x4 out in the driveway in case you need to take off, whatever. Maybe you need backup gasoline. Who knows, right? But you are doing all these things, by getting all these things and by thinking it through, you are inoculating yourself against any kind of threat, right? So as I note on here, if you don't, if you forget a hatchet, well, then you can't chop up larger pieces of wood, and now you're vulnerable to larger, medium-sized trees because you can't do anything about that. You have to gather all the smaller pieces of twigs and so on, right? So you have a kind of a vulnerability there in that you have to spend more time gathering wood as opposed to just chopping down a few big pieces, right? Or if you forget a flashlight, now you're vulnerable to the setting sun. So your vulnerabilities are connected to threats, and threats are connected to vulnerabilities here. So now think about your kind of mental equipment, right? If you haven't prepared for a message coming your way, if you haven't thought through a topic, if you haven't thought through an issue, if you haven't done research, if you haven't kind of planned for the possibility of being confronted by something, you can get kind of pushed around, you can get thrown off guard, and so you are in that sense vulnerable to the threat of messages. And so a message can be an attack in the sense, I keep using this language because, again, we're doing this analogy thing, right? But a message can be an attack if you are not ready to deal with it, right? If you haven't thought it through, if you haven't prepared yourself. Some of the examples that he gives in the application section on health reminded me a lot of when I was in school and growing up, and there was all of this like, don't drink and drive, don't drink and drive. They hammered us so hard with these messages. Kids back in the 80s drank a lot more and they drove a lot more. And that's basically, we didn't have the internet. We didn't have all the like online stuff. So we lived our lives outside. Cars were super important. Get together with your friends out at the park or down the street or just driving up and down the street. That's what we did, right? So the authorities, the parents, the teachers, the local leaders and everyone was like so worked up by drinking and driving. We got hammered by messaging. We would have to go to the gym every year. There would be some kind of group would come in and give us the message. Don't drink and drive. If you drink and drive, this will happen. And I remember for me, they hammered me so hard with this message that I actually, for a long time, thought that if you're in a vehicle and you take a drink of alcohol, you're going to crash immediately. Like, you're going to die. It blew my mind the first time I was in a vehicle and I saw it, and this, I'm not condoning this, but someone, had a beer or whatever in a car as they were driving, and it was like, we're going to die right now. This is going to happen right now. We're going to crash this instant. And I was like, you're drinking? You're driving? Like, or someone had a drink and then drove, and it's like, we're going to die, we're going to die. And you realize it's not like instant and automatic, but the messaging inoculated me successfully, right, against doing that practice. So it works. It certainly does work. Parents do this with children all the time. Don't smoke. Don't have sex. Don't do da-da-da-da. These are the consequences. And so you're implanting all of these ideas and sort of readying your kids for what's going to come at them. You're inoculating them. So let's see here. The basic model. Yeah, page number 3 there, the basic model on 221 is like super important. So that one page alone, or 2 pages or whatever it is, definitely spend some time there, because we're mostly interested in kind of just the basic stuff here. I wanted to introduce this concept of steel manning. The chapter doesn't mention steel manning, but it's a related kind of concept. So there's a fallacy known as the straw man fallacy, right? And it's like if you're ever in an argument with someone and you find that, or they find that they're confronted by a stronger argument, that your argument is too strong, they can essentially avoid it by going after a straw man. A straw man is like you create some irrelevant topic or issue and you attack it because it's easy to bring down. It's easy to destroy a straw man, right? You just like knock it over, light it on fire or whatever. But the point is it's not actually related to the main topic, right? So the straw man fallacy is like, that's irrelevant. You're attacking and trying to beat me by going after something that's a side issue. It's not a directly related issue. So the straw man argument is a weak one. And it's basically admitting your own vulnerabilities because you're not going after the main argument. You're the core issues here. You're kind of going around it and going after something easy. Oh, yeah, well, you would say that because someone in your family da-da-da-da. It's like, well, what does that have to do with anything? You're just trying to make me look bad or whatever, right? So opposed to that is this idea of the steel man argument. I like this idea. Right now, this is sort of a debater's approach. I don't know if anyone's ever had any like debate experience. We used to have we still have a debate program. My buddy Jake Thompson has now moved on from our department. Bye, Jake. And he's now the director of general education for all of UNLV. Yay, Jake! But he ran our debate program for many years and very successfully. And what you do when you are a debate, sort of a competitive debate program, is you spend all of your time or much of your time researching the opposite arguments, right? Why? So that you can prepare for them, so that you can refute them, so that you can be ready for them. And you go really hard in the direction of like, what are they going to say? What are they likely to come at us with? And so it's important to know your opponent's argument as well, if not better than your own, right? So that you can be ready. So Steel Manning is this idea of, okay, you and I are having a disagreement, or I don't believe that position, but let me give it the best possible version, the strongest possible version, right? So I don't want to give up eating meat. I keep using this example. It's very relevant and convenient. I don't want to give up, let's say I don't want to give up eating meat, but you keep coming at me with these arguments about being a vegan or a pescatarian or whatever, and I want to. So in order for me to deal with your constant coming at me, let me give veganism the strongest possible defense, right? Like what are the 6, 7, 8 strongest arguments in defense of veganism? And if I know all of them, now I can spend some time thinking about, okay, what's my response? How do I deal with this? How do I deal with this? So strong manning is considering the best possible version of your opponent's arguments so that you can inoculate yourself more readily against those potential arguments coming at you. I hope that makes sense, because I think it's an important concept. And I think we should do this a lot, right? Instead of just avoiding the thing that you don't want to encounter, what if we actually understood it even better than they did? That's the idea of the Steel Manning, and it's a form of inoculation, a very strong one. Let's see here. Supportive pretreatment is like enhancing your own position. Refutational pretreatment is that kind of now let's anticipate the opposite, right? So supportive pretreatment is like enhancing like vitamins, like making your own position as strong as possible, thinking it through. Refutational pretreatment is, okay, now how can you anticipate challenges and how can you get ready for them? There's some interesting stuff, 8, 9, 10 on 8 and 9 on politics and commerce. In politics, there's always, especially during campaigns, inoculation is constantly happening. My opponent will say this. However, what my opponent doesn't realize, that's inoculation. You're inoculating your viewers, your followers, your audience against what your opponent is likely to say about you, right? And it's this constant getting in front of. I think of inoculation as like getting out in front. Anticipating so as to avoid tripping up, right? And so again, you're thinking about your trip, your camping trip, your trip to Vietnam. You're trying to get out in front of any potential threats by anticipate. Politicians are constantly doing this. The savvy campaigners are always trying to be aware of and have teams of people scouring the internet, looking for any kind of people are talking about this. Let's get ready. Let's ready that defense, right? Huge part of being a political figure and campaigning, especially, and politics is always kind of campaigning, is that anticipation and preparation and getting ready to deal with the attacks coming in. So you're constantly trying to inoculate your followers, your audience, your constituents, community, whatever, against the stuff that they might encounter. It's kind of like the parent-child thing. It's like, they're going to say this, but I want you to remember who you are, who we are, kind of thing, right? And then number 9, commerce. Inoculation can either help or thwart marketing. I wonder if anyone remembers the tastes great, less filling. Probably not. I don't even know if there's a memory of it. I mean, there's a bit of a memory of the where's the beef slogan. That was, I think, Wendy's going back into the 80s. Where's the beef? These old ladies go up to this counter, they order this hamburger from this other stand, and they get it, and they look down, and they're like, where's the beef? And then Wendy's is like, we have beef in our hamburgers. How sad is it that's, that argument we have to have. Anyway, there was a beer campaign. Was it Miller Lite, Coors Light? I think it was Miller Lite. And it's like, the critiques of Miller Lite are like, it tastes like crap because it's light. So it's a light beer, but because it's a light beer, it tastes gross. It's weak and thin, right? Or tastes great, less filling, right? Or what was the other one? So it tastes like crap, or it tastes fine, but what's the other critique? Or is that it doesn't fill you up, or it's not, or it's too healthy, or whatever. Anyway, there's two potential kind of reasons why you might not want to buy and consume this beer, and the taste great, less filling is meant to kind of ward off both critiques or both resistances. And I remember that there was this one commercial where it was like a football stadium, and like half of the stands, half of the people in the stadium would shout, "It tastes great!" And the other half of the stadium would be like, "It's less filling!" And it's like, how genius to contain within this one ad both inoculative efforts, right, against both critiques. So you can see how Persuasion is kind of dealing with the dealing with your innate resistances, and it's an attempt to kind of get around those resistances, right? And so it's a way of acknowledging that which might thwart your ability to move your product, right? So it's acknowledging defenses, anticipating the anticipated. All right. So I note on the last page here, don't stress too much about the stuff beginning on 225, issues in contemporary inoculation theory. That starts getting a little bit deep. However, there's a couple of issues that are quite interesting and relevant that I think we should take a look at. And so number 12 there's the issue of timing, like how long, two issues. How long does it take to inoculate? How many repetitions? How long of time? I can imagine many different scenarios. But I think, think about, again, what I said about going to school and don't drink and drive. It was like every year, all the time, and it was many, many different ad campaigns. It was on television. It was over the loudspeakers. It was in the gym in these performances. So repetition is important in terms of getting the message across. But also there's that issue of like how long before the threat comes in, the attack, does one need to be inoculated, or does it start to wear off over time, right? Like if you repeat the message, inoculate, but then they don't even encounter the threat for a few years, is the inoculation still in effect, right? Or do we need a booster kind of concept of like you need to kind of re-up the messaging, the inoculation? You can imagine that being important. If repetition matters in terms of getting the antibodies in you in the first place, then it probably matters over time that you need to kind of revisit, remind, boost that message, make sure that it's in there. All right, the last issue is about affect, and we could talk at some great length about affect, but it's important, and I think all you got to do is look at the last couple of years of COVID and in just a crazy public health messaging. Think about Fauci. Think about all the resistance to Fauci. Think about the CDC and its messaging and the public's reaction. So much of what's been going on here is relevant in terms of inoculation, in terms of this business of threats and vulnerabilities and how we designate one versus the other and how bad is it, how severe it is. And running through all of it was affect. There was so much rage. One of the things I enjoyed about being in Vietnam for 2 months this summer is that everyone wore masks, but more importantly, no one really kind of seemed to get too worked up about it one way or the other. It was just kind of like a thing that most people did, but I wasn't wearing masks at the time because I actually got COVID as soon as I landed in Vietnam. I've had 2 or 3 booster shots at this point. My attitude was, I think I'm, more or less okay. And I put it on a few times when I was in a really crowded space or whatever. But for the most part, people just wore them, and they didn't look at you weird, and there wasn't a lot of this kind of like tension. Affect is like sensation. There's effect, which is like consequence, and affect is sensation. It's about feeling. So affects run through inoculation, and especially anger, especially fear, especially like reactance. That business of reactance is like being defensive. There's a lot of emotion that runs through these issues. We're dealing with threats. We're dealing with challenges. We're dealing with opposition. So perceived threats can raise affects of fear and especially anger. Think about how much anger there was around the issue of masks and vaccinations. It's a super relevant, important factor. I'm not saying good, bad, either way. I'm just saying it's a part of the dynamic of threat, influence, and guarding against it. There's all kinds of nuanced stuff in there about like when you inoculate, you can actually start to initiate the anger. You think about like, again, the don't drink and drive thing. You tell these young kids from an early age, don't drink. If anyone tries to get in the car and they've been drinking, they're going to kill you, right? So you're kind of implanting some potential anger in there, right? It's like if now I'm getting worked up about the very idea that someone might drive while drinking. And what if I don't know that they've been drinking and they drive anyway? Now I'm angry. And so the actual inoculation, because you're giving kind of doses of the problem, can actually instill some anger where it wasn't before. And maybe that anger is actually useful, but it can also spill in different directions. Anyway, the point is, affect is a big part of messaging, threat, vulnerability, feelings of fear, feelings of being exposed, feelings of being attacked. All of this stuff is part of the set of dynamics we're talking about here. So that's a pretty good place for me to wrap up. 24 minutes is plenty. So we're not talking directly about persuasion in a lot of these basic theories. What are we talking about? We're talking about the brain. Again, 20th century theories of persuasion are really 20th century theories about how the brain works. Inside the body, just at a personal level, but also at the kind of social level, right? So we're dealing with social psychology, we're dealing with group psychology, we're dealing with how it is that people react to things and process things. So we're dealing with some core psychological dynamics here. We could go very deep into this stuff. This is not a class in psychology, but we have to be thinking about some tendencies and some patterns and recurrences and so on in terms of like stuff that has to do with messaging and has to do with this question of influence, all right? So inoculation is a kind of inherently conservative way to protect yourself against future threats. Now, some of those future threats might be bad threats that we want to protect against, but you can also imagine inoculation against, what about potential good threats? Think about cults, right? Raising people to believe things that are just patently untrue and inoculating them against reason itself, right? And so you can inoculate against all kinds of external threats, even if those threats are not actually threats, but good advice. The dynamics remain the same, right? We are warding against potential threats to our vulnerabilities, and our vulnerabilities are simply those things that we have not yet readied ourselves for. They are vulnerable because we have not done the work of shoring up our defenses. Fascinating stuff. I'm quite taken by all of it. I could talk about this kind of stuff and think about examples forever, but I think we're pretty good there. So I'll stop there, and that'll be it for the first unit, and we will now start preparing for our first test and moving into the next unit, Unit 2, which is about fairly formal, fairly explicit forms of persuasion like political and deliberation and so on. So I'm looking forward to that. Hope everyone's well. See you soon.